In February 1943, the frozen ruins of Stalingrad bore silent testimony to one of the greatest defeats in German military history. The 6th Army of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had been destroyed, with more than 300,000 men killed, captured, or wounded. For Adolf Hitler and the Wehrmacht, the crushing loss was not only military but psychological. The aura of German invincibility had been broken. Yet, Hitler was not willing to concede the initiative on the Eastern Front. Within months, he approved Operation Citadel, a massive offensive aimed at destroying the Red Army's forces in the salient around the city of Kursk. This bulge in the front line, jutting about 150 kilometers west into German-occupied territory, seemed like a tempting target. By pinching off the salient from north and south, the Wehrmacht hoped to encircle and annihilate Soviet armies, regain momentum, and perhaps even stabilize the Eastern Front. For Joseph Stalin and his generals, the Kursk salient was not a weakness, but an opportunity. Soviet intelligence, aided by reconnaissance and the British-provided ultra-decrypts, knew of the German plan months in advance. Unlike in 1941 or 1942, the Red Army now had time to prepare. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky convinced Stalin to adopt a defensive strategy. Let the Germans exhaust themselves against layers of fortifications, then launch a massive counteroffensive. Thus, the stage was set for one of the most titanic battles of the Second World War, an engagement that would bring together millions of men, thousands of tanks, and entire air fleets. Kursk would become the largest tank battle in history, and its outcome would decisively shape the war in the East. From March to June 1943, both sides mobilized unprecedented resources. On the German side, Hitler to launch of Operation Citadel several times, waiting for new weapons, the formidable Panther tank, the massive Tiger I, and the fearsome Ferdinand tank destroyer. The Wehrmacht gathered nearly 900,000 soldiers, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 2,000 aircraft for the attack. The plan was to strike simultaneously from north and south, with Field Marshal Walter Model's 9th Army attacking from the north, and Field Marshal Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army from the south, supported by Army Detachment Kempf. The Soviets, however, outmatched this with sheer numbers and meticulous preparation. Stalin approved a defensive network unparalleled in depth and complexity. Across the Kursk salient, the Red Army constructed 8 defensive belts-layered fortifications, stretching hundreds of kilometers, including 6,000 kilometers of trenches, 500,000 mines per front, and tens of thousands of anti-tank guns and artillery pieces. Behind these lines stood reserves, the steppe front, ready to counterattack once the Germans were worn down. By July 1943, the Soviet forces in the salient numbered nearly 2 million men, 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 2,800 aircraft. The Red Army of 1943 was no longer the disorganized, poorly equipped force of 1941. It had been bloodied in 2 years of brutal fighting, but it had learned, adapted, and modernized. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the German offensive began with a massive artillery barrage, answered immediately by Soviet counter-barrages. Then came the armored spearheads. In the north, Model's 9th Army pushed toward the city of Kursk. The Germans advanced into a maze of Soviet minefields, trenches, and anti-tank defenses. Progress was slow, casualties high. Entire armored columns bogged down under fire from concealed Soviet guns. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army achieved greater momentum. Elite divisions, including the 2 SS Panzer Corps, smashed into Soviet defenses near Belgorod, forcing bloody battles in villages and fields. The fighting was savage and unrelenting. The Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force clashed in the skies in enormous dogfights involving hundreds of planes. On the ground, Every kilometer was contested with artillery barrages, tank duels, and close-quarters infantry combat. By July 9th, after 4 days of ferocious combat, the Germans had advanced only a few dozen kilometers. The Soviets resisted with resilience, but the southern thrust under Hoth still posed a grave threat. Stalin's commanders knew that the battle's decisive clash was about to come. On July 12, 1943, near the small town of Prokhorovka, the southern front of the battle reached its climax. Here, the two SS Panzer Corps, armed with Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, encountered the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov. In one of the most dramatic armored collisions in history, nearly 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns engaged in a chaotic, close-range melee. The terrain favored neither side, rolling fields cut by ravines with little room for maneuver. Soviet T-34s and Churchills charged at full speed, often ramming German tanks or closing into fire at point-blank range, where the thicker armor of the Tigers mattered less. The battlefield was a hellscape of burning steel, exploding ammunition, and twisted wrecks. Although Soviet losses were staggering, hundreds of tanks destroyed in a single day, the Germans failed to achieve a breakthrough. The Soviet defensive depth held, and the Red Army retained the initiative. By mid-July, Hitler's gamble was collapsing. In the north, Model's 9th Army had been ground to a halt. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army could not penetrate beyond Prokhorovka. Meanwhile, Soviet counteroffensives, Operation Kutuzov in the north and Operation Pokrovadets-Rumyantsov in the south, began to roll back German gains. On July 13, 1943, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. The Wehrmacht, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, had been stopped dead. Kursk marked not just a failed offensive, but the last time Germany would attempt a major strategic attack on the Eastern Front. From this moment onward, the Red Army would dictate the tempo of the war, pushing inexorably westward toward Berlin. When the dust of July settled over the Kursk salient, the landscape was unrecognizable. Fields once green were now littered with the charred husks of thousands of tanks. Entire villages had been flattened by artillery. The acrid smell of burning fuel and scorched earth lingered for weeks. Both sides suffered catastrophic losses. The Germans lost an estimated 200,000 men, 500 tanks, and 700 aircraft. Soviet losses were even heavier, nearly 860,000 casualties, more than 6,000 tanks, and over 1,600 aircraft. On the surface, the Red Army's sacrifice looked unsustainable. Yet the crucial difference lay in reserves. The Soviet Union could replace its losses. Germany could not. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin across multiple fronts and bleeding manpower, would never again mount an offensive of such magnitude in the east. Kursk became a point of no return. After July 1943, the Red Army launched a relentless series of offensives, recapturing Kharkov, liberating Smolensk, and eventually advancing toward Kiev. By early 1944, the Germans were in full retreat across the entire Eastern Front. Beyond the statistics, the human experience of Kursk defies comprehension. Soldiers who survived spoke of an apocalypse made real. For German tank crews, the battle was a nightmare of endless Soviet waves. In the words of one Panzer commander, "We destroyed dozens of T-34s, but more kept coming. It was like fighting the ocean." The technological edge of the Tiger and Panther tanks could not compensate for the sheer numbers, nor the exhaustion of men who had been fighting continuously since 1941. For Soviet troops, Kursk was both horror and redemption. Many recalled the terror of advancing under withering German fire, knowing that survival was unlikely. Yet morale was different from the early days of the war. At Kursk, Soviet soldiers knew they were not merely defending but turning the tide. As one Red Army veteran later recalled, "For the first time, we felt the Germans could be beaten not just in one battle, but in the whole war." Civilian suffering, though less recorded than at Stalingrad or Leningrad, was also immense. Villages in the Kursk region were bombed, shelled, and burned. Thousands of peasants were displaced, their homes destroyed in the crossfire of the largest mechanized clash in human history. The significance of Kursk lies not only in its scale but in its consequences. The last German offensive in the east. Kursk marked the final attempt by Hitler to seize the initiative on the Eastern Front. Never again would the Wehrmacht launch a large-scale offensive in the east. From this point, Germany was locked in a defensive struggle. The Red Army's coming of age. Kursk demonstrated that the Red Army was no longer the disorganized force of 1941. It had mastered defensive warfare, combined arms tactics, and large-scale coordination. Soviet commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky proved their ability to outplan and outlast the Wehrmacht. Impact on the wider war. The timing of Kursk coincided with the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. With German reserves bleeding in the east, Hitler could not reinforce Italy effectively. The result was a two-front drain on German resources, accelerating the collapse of the Reich. Psychological turning point. Just as Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility, Kursk destroyed the myth of German recovery. For the Red Army, it was proof that victory was inevitable, however costly. Kursk was also a laboratory of modern mechanized warfare. The Germans introduced the Panther and Ferdinand tank destroyer. Both proved formidable but plagued by mechanical failures. Many Panthers broke down before even reaching battle. The Soviets relied heavily on the T-34, whose reliability, mobility, and mass production compensated for its weaker armor against Tigers and Panthers. In the melee of Prokhorovka, sheer numbers and aggressive tactics neutralized German technical advantages. Air power played a massive role. The Luftwaffe deployed the feared Stuka dive bombers, while the Soviets unleashed the Il-2 Sturmovik, nicknamed the Flying Tank. Control of the skies shifted back and forth, but the Soviets increasingly gained the upper hand as the battle dragged on. Kursk demonstrated that technology alone could not guarantee victory. Strategy, preparation, logistics, and the will to sustain. Losses were equally decisive. From today's vantage point, the Battle of Kursk stands as one of the pivotal confrontations of the Second World War, alongside Stalingrad, El Alamein, and D-Day. Yet its uniqueness lies in sheer scale. Historians estimate that more than 3 million men, 8,000 tanks, and 5,000 aircraft took part in the wider Kursk campaign. No other battle in history has matched this concentration of mechanized force. It was, in many ways, the climax of industrialized warfare, a demonstration of how the factories, railways, and resources of entire nations could be transformed into firepower. From a modern military perspective, Kursk also offers sobering lessons: the power of defense. Soviet defenses proved that well-prepared fortifications and depth could blunt even the most formidable offensive. The limits of technology. Superior German tanks could not overcome poor timing, inadequate logistics, and overwhelming Soviet numbers. The importance of intelligence. Soviet foreknowledge of Operation Citadel, through intelligence and careful planning, shaped the entire course of the battle. For Russia, Kursk remains a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. The battlefield is now dotted with memorials, museums, and monuments. Each July, ceremonies commemorate the soldiers who fell in the fields of Belgorod, Orel, and Prokhorovka. The story of Kursk is woven into the fabric of Russian memory of the Great Patriotic War. For Germany, Kursk is remembered as a tragic culmination of overreach, a battle that consumed resources desperately needed elsewhere, squandered in a futile attempt to reverse an inevitable decline. Military historians often view Hitler's insistence on launching Citadel, despite the delays and risks, as a fatal strategic blunder. Globally, Kursk endures as a case study in the transition of the Second World War. It was the moment when the Red Army seized permanent momentum. From the charred wrecks around Kursk, one can trace a straight line through the liberation of Eastern Europe, the crossing of the Vistula, and the final storming of Berlin in May 1945. The Battle of Kursk was more than the largest tank battle ever fought. It was the definitive end of Germany's ability to dictate the war in the East. The human cost was staggering, the suffering immense, but the strategic outcome was clear. After Kursk, the Red Army advanced relentlessly while the Wehrmacht retreated, step by step. For the soldiers who fought there, Kursk was both a furnace of destruction and a crucible of victory. Looking back from the 21st century, Kursk stands as a reminder of the terrifying scale of industrial warfare. It teaches us that even the most advanced technology cannot prevail without strategy, preparation, and the resilience of ordinary men and women. Above all, Kursk symbolizes the moment when the tide of history turned irrevocably against Nazi Germany, paving the way for the liberation of Europe and the eventual end of the most devastating conflict in human history.